can carry on talking. Don't worry. Just I'll wait until I'm told everyone's in. Jonathan? I think we're starting in 1 minute, folks. So. It's a nice room to sit in anyway, isn't it?
Marvelous room.
It took me hours to paint this. It's actually quite an interesting picture because it starts off, it's actually apparently very good art. But then as it goes around, it kind of deteriorates. And this one here is right at the end.
Was he just bored or getting old?
I think it was but,
yeah,
it's full of kind of cartoons of famous people who are kind of oddly sounding holes and things, kind of Newton and Descartes. And, you know,
yes.
And it's not quite obvious why they're all there, really.
But Jim was beginning to take a hold on it.
It's supposed to tell the story of human progress.
Progress.
In arts, manufactures, and commerce. You know, throughout the
It's wonderful.
Behind us is the first portrayal in British art of the ancient Olympics.
Is that right?
Which we didn't really do much with in Olympic year. I don't know quite why.
It's one of those things that only appears obvious after the opportunities pass.
Yes, yes. Some bright spark tells you afterwards.
That dome, I don't know why we don't open it more often. The dome does open up.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? So in English heritage are obviously in a benign mood when you, well, they were reasonably okay about things.
When you
did the
yeah, well, because we're going back to the original flat 40s. So I think.
Oh, of course they'll love that. Yes, yes.
Got rid of the brake seating. Okay. Good. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Welcome to the RSA. I'm Matthew Taylor, the Chief Executive. Here, I'm delighted to be chairing this conference, Developing Socially Productive Places. We're very grateful to British Land for supporting the conference, which is bringing together leaders from policy and practice in the built environment to discuss how public and private investment can best contribute to economic, and also what we call social productivity, strengthening local communities. And we all know that buildings and infrastructure are crucial building blocks of a successful economy and society. There are a number of different actors who combine to bring the built environment to life: planners, developers, construction contractors, but also the consultants, politicians, civil servants, residents, and community leaders who create the policies and regulations that shape development. For the last decade at least, professionals have been urged to focus on placemaking and to consider how best they can involve local communities in that process of placemaking. I think one of the things we want to do this afternoon is, in a sense, to kind of flip that script slightly and to explore how investment in the built environment can best appreciate and deepen community assets, understand deeply how communities work, how communities see the communities in which they live, and how we can strengthen those social networks. Social network analysis is one of the RSA's kind of core strengths. So we are fascinated by the degree to which development draws upon and strengthens local social networks, because we know that social networks are critical to the success of places, but also to individuals, their opportunities, their life chances, their resilience. So this conference will explore new relationships between actors in creating the built environment and hopefully start to surface new policies, practices, tools, and even institutions. If you want to get involved in the online conversation and you use Twitter, please use #developingplaces. Can you put your phone on silent, if possible? And I don't really need to tell you where the exits are. That's all pretty obvious. Now, we're going to hear from two people to frame the conversation for today, and then we're going to have a bit of a Q&A before I invite you to go into a set of working groups to explore particular themes. First, we're going to hear from Chris Grigg, who's CEO of British Land, and then our keynote address will be delivered by Mark Prisk MP, former Minister of Housing. So first of all, can I ask you to welcome Chris Grigg?
First of all, thank you to Matthew and to the team for putting this conference together. We very much appreciate it. We're also very happy to be supporting this. It seems to be a great time to be having the discussion, and that the discussion is absolutely important. I guess we're excited by about at least three things about today. First of all, the participants gathered here today. I think that's a real opportunity to the topics in terms of what the work streams are going to deliver on. And third, and maybe most important, the potential conclusions. For us, and to be clear, commercial development is absolutely critical to what we do as a business. And it has been a very successful part of our business in a number of ways over the last few years. But getting it right on a broader scale than just the commercial aspects of it is, in my view, critical to what we do, how we do it. And not just because that sense of engaging with the community, but also it is the combination of those two things, the way they intertwine, which actually will end up defining how successful individual projects are. So to be clear, the topics that we're going to be discussing today, are important to us. We welcome the debate. We look forward, as I say, to the conclusions, and I want to be clear, it's our ambition to apply those conclusions to what we do in our business going forward. So this is not just some sort of academic exercise for us, it comes to the heart of what we do. It's particularly exciting for me that today's discussion is tied in with, if you like, a worked example. And most of you will have seen this document, Regent's Place at 30. If you haven't got it, it's outside. You can also have my copy. We're launching today a review of the Regent's Place, if you like, project. And that's a project that for British Land has been going on for 30 years. I look around the room and there are a number of people who've shared that journey with us for an extended piece of time. But it's quite unusual when you think about it. Ours is a long-term business by definition, but it's even for us in this long-term business, it is quite unusual to have the opportunity to look back at a project over 30 years and be able to draw some conclusions from that. And we've certainly done that, and we've tried to share that with you. For those of you who don't know, Regent's Place is just east of Regent's Park. We bought our first property there in 1984, and we completed it just last year in terms of the, if you will, physically completing it. It represents today 2 million square feet of offices. We have 350 residential units, many of them social housing. And it is, as I say, commercially a great success story for us, but also, back to my earlier contention, in terms of the overall experience, the impact on the community. And I'm absolutely convinced that the success we've had, and to be clear, I'm a mere custodian of it. There are many people, often in this room, but a number of them no longer with British Land, who've had real impact. But it's been our engagement with the community, our investment in the real needs of that community that have been central to the long-term success. If you actually look back at it, the story is quite remarkable. Back in 1992, around the time of a murder on the estate, there was a West Euston partnership which was set up, had membership right across the community, but British Land also joined very early in that process. And what we've been able to do through that process is understand what's been important to the community, help to invest, and do things which practically have had real impact, whether that be new walkways and pedestrian crossings, which have actually reduced the impact of the Euston Road, which tended to be a real barrier. And these things often have been relevant and important both to the community, but also to the tenants and to the workers on the estate. So all important stuff. But But equally important to that commercial success, to the things that we can point to and say, gee, this has happened, is actually when you look at some of the socio-economic impacts of what has happened there. Deprivation levels, and as those of us who have been at all involved know, deprivation around there was high, has fallen more sharply than almost anywhere else in London over the period we're talking about. We supported nearly 7,000 jobs during the recent construction period, and over that 30 years there have been other times when those sorts of numbers of jobs have been supported. And interestingly, in terms of employment improvement, it's also one of those areas which has had the best performance levels right across London. So, for us, a great success story. For us, a bunch of learnings, some of which ought to have been obvious, some of which actually we only figured out as we went along, if truth be known. But for me, part of what we did by being able to survey, by the discipline, if you will, of creating this document, is to go a stage further and be starting to say to ourselves, what are the lessons that we can apply going forward in different places? And in that context, I really welcome today as a way of continuing to pull those thoughts together, learning from all the things that you have to give, and as I say, undertaking to work that thought process, work those ideas, work those conclusions into what we all do in our day-to-day business. And with that, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And after we've heard from Mark, then Chris, you'll be staying up here to take a few questions as well. That's great. So please welcome Mark Prisk.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I have a confession to make at the start. Ever since I was, I think, 6, I've had an addiction to build. It started with Lego. We now all know, of course, it has a demonic influence. We've learned this in the recent days. But Lego, for me, as for a lot of other children, sparked the imagination as to what you could build, what you could do. The houses, and as I recall, the castles and occasionally the spaceports, as I think I remember, all those kinds of imaginary settlements that actually capture your thoughts about the kind of place you'd like to build. Now, more recently, you'll be pleased to know I have moved on from Lego, but I've actually turned to another drug. It's called SimCity. And I suspect one or two people in the property world will be similar addicts like me. And of course, the brilliant thing about this computer game is it allows you to design and build, not only rebuild other cities, London, Berlin, Sydney, but it also allows you to build Priskville, if there were to be such a horrendous prospect. But what I wanted to say about that is that, of course, it's attractive to me as a chartered surveyor, it's attractive to me as a politician, but it doesn't take away from the simple reality that systems, whether it's of plastic bricks or computer algorithms, don't build communities. They can build, but they can't actually create the kind of social networks that I know we want to talk about today, the kind of communities where people choose, yes, to live, but also to work, to learn, and indeed to play. Now, when I became housing minister, despite the fact of being a chartered surveyor, and it was a novelty that we should have a minister who had some professional knowledge of the area he was dealing with, but self-evidently that didn't last very long, I was struck at how the professionals in the sector, both in Whitehall and indeed in the industry, talk about housing units. They don't talk about homes. Now, that may seem a semantic point, but it actually highlights, I think, the challenge that we're here to consider. Because whilst government and developers can build houses or cities, it's people that make homes, that foster communities. So I really welcome the underlying agenda of this conference in trying to, first of all, understand what it is that people need, that communities need to flourish, and then for policymakers and for developers to respond to that need, and not, as is often and perhaps usually the case, the other way around. Now, this is a broad subject. I could probably spend the next 10 minutes just looking at the issue, for example, of how do we best apply smart technology that's emerging now in our cities. But rather than that, I thought instead I would try to focus on what is the sort of underlying policy context for this, and then offer 5 challenges which hopefully provoke some debate. Now, I think in my reckoning, for the first time in a quarter of a century, housing is going to be one of the top issues at the next election. Housing in recent elections, let's be honest about this, has been usually overshadowed in recent years by schools and by hospitals. But the need to build more homes has now become sufficiently pressing that it is a top priority and for all the major parties. And whilst housing starts are up by, 23% over a year, there's a long, long way to go. We are still building roughly half the homes we actually need year on year. So this renewed political focus is welcome, but I put alongside it a significant caveat. In an election year, there is the danger that the political parties seek to outbid each other in how many homes can we build in the next 5 years. A classic political danger. And if they do that, there is the real prospect that we repeat the old mistakes of building quickly and cheaply, and building without really understanding what it is that makes a community, or indeed what it is that people want. For example, the debate around new towns or garden cities is a good example. They have a role to play, there's no doubt about that, but in the long term. After all, Milton Keynes was designated as a new town in 1967. It was at least 6 years before the first homes started to come out of the ground, and it's 30 years before the master plan is fulfilled. So this is a long-term game, and it's not something that can be fixed as an instant solution in next year's party manifestos. And that is where localism comes in. Localism began as a direct response to the failings of the old top-down, Whitehall knows best approach. It is a rejection of the idea that a single solution always works everywhere. It was enshrined in the 2011 Localism Act, and what started as a conservative idea is now a principle that has been adopted and embraced across the political divide. It is essentially, in my mind, a belief that decisions made by local people are more likely to last, that actually a variety of solutions and ideas is a good thing and not to be decried, and that if people are part of a decision about their community, they're far more likely to embrace the outcome. Take local economic development, for example. The old regional development agencies were set up in Whitehall. They were 9 similarly sized areas, and the truth was that for most of them, the boundaries bore no relation to the actual local economy. And in contrast, the new local enterprise partnerships are very different. They're not uniform in size or shape or purpose or role. Their area and their boundaries vary enormously because local businesses and civic leaders chose them and not ministers in Whitehall. And even though they're only 18 months, 2 years underway, we're starting to see a sense of ownership and engagement, especially in some of our greater regional cities. Go and talk to Howard Bernstein and his team up in Manchester. There is a real sense that the Manchester City region is an economic area and is now being given the tools to actually turn that into a reality. It's the same story in planning, for example. The old regional plans and assemblies were unaccountable to local people, and the area very often had little or no sense of cohesion. We in Hertfordshire, which faces the southeast, is part of London, were linked with the lovely turkey farmers of Norfolk. Now, what economically or in planning terms linked us is beyond me, but that was the nature of Whitehall determining uniform sizes of assemblies and plans. Now, the localist approach has meant replacing these with local plans based on long-standing areas, borough, county, or city boundaries. And as such, they are areas that relate to established communities and to which people do feel attached. Indeed, the very intensity of some of the debates we're having at the moment around draft local plans reflects, in my mind, that strong sense of association, that sense of accountability. However painful, I have to say, it can be for us as parliamentary representatives and indeed our councillors. So localism has changed much of the policy context around housing and development. But what are the other factors that can help us create socially productive places? Well, I thought I would flag up 5 challenges which I hope will set the debate going. First of all, how do we fit more people into the same space? You know, unlike other major economies, our population is growing. Indeed, it's growing faster than any other country in Europe. And living as we do on a small island, we need to rethink how we make the best use, not just of brownfield land, but also of future settlements. See, I believe that the old low-rise, low-density model of the post-war new towns is the wrong approach. It takes too much land, but more importantly, it spreads settlements out in a way that makes it incredibly difficult for communities to bind. Putting it very crudely and simply, if you have to get in the car to drive to buy a newspaper in the morning, when will you meet your neighbors? When will that neighborhood actually become a reality? Equally, we need to make better use of the existing urban areas. Now, that does mean, in some areas, greater density, and not just in central London. But this isn't a debate about skyscrapers. It's about making the best use of the land and buildings we have to house a growing population, and in doing so, using an urban form that brings people together. Let me start and be clear about this. There's no single answer. Indeed, that's the danger of this kind of area, which is we more move ourselves to replacing one answer with another. That is not the approach. Diversity of thought should be what we're about. That's why we will need high-rise, and as was proposed last week, mid-rise. It will depend on the locality and the relevance of the decision in that area. But most significantly in this, I think what we're going to need to do is to show to people why when we do build to a greater density, it's good for them and good for the community as a whole. The second challenge I want to suggest is that the growth in population is largely driven by the happy fact that we are living longer. The Office for National Statistics is very clear about this. The rate of growth of those aged over 65 is 3 times that of the rest of the population. So whilst many commentators have naturally tended to focus on things like migration, actually the big issue is our aging population. That means rethinking the design of our homes, both in terms of function, but also access. It means that we in politics have to be much better at integrating health and housing policy than we have so far. But I think it also means that we need to think about the kind of communities that are going to emerge as the population ages. For example, at present, most homes for the elderly are on the edge of our towns. In trying to quite naturally provide seclusion for the elderly, in fact, what we've done is increase their isolation. But it doesn't have to be this way. My own constituency in Hertford, Riversmead Housing Association, has actually built its retirement homes in the middle of the town. In fact, they've gone one step further. They brought the GP's practice into the building. And what that's done is to help to integrate the community in a much better way than we've seen elsewhere. So, and I have to say locally, it's certainly proving very popular. So I think my question here is, what needs to change so that we can truly integrate this older population? And where are the barriers? Are they financial, legal? Or is there also, I suspect, an element of a cultural barrier here? Thirdly, how do we best deliver places where people can live, but also work, learn, and yes, play? The old post-war suburban housing estates often lack any amenities, and along that, any focal point for the community. And this isn't just about putting different types of buildings next to each other. It's actually about the buildings themselves needing to be more flexible as people's lives at home and work increasingly overlap. And it begs, I think, a broader question, which is, are single-use classes in the planning system becoming out of date? You know, as mobile technology moves so that your office is actually coming with you, does a rigid single-use planning system lock in redundancy to the built environment? I see this as well when I talk to corporates around the ICT world or the pharmaceutical world. Increasingly now, they are looking for production, research, and development to be together, indeed often to be in interchangeable spaces. Now, I appreciate, and there's one or two frowns emerging as I say this, I appreciate those of you who are investors or owners will reel from the idea of broad, mixed-use asset classes. But I think I would put the question back, isn't it time to recognize how people's lives are changing and not, in fact, leave those assets to be increasingly vulnerable to becoming redundant? The fourth challenge I want to offer is, what does the public realm actually mean today? Take city centre shopping malls. Lying in the middle of our communities, these popular meeting places are very often privately policed and privately owned. They are no longer public in the sense of common ownership or rights of way. And my question is, does this matter if that space is managed in a way that is responsive to what the community and people want? After all, this phenomenon is not a new one. Take the great estates of central London, Cadogan, Howard Walden, Grosvenor Estates. They have all successfully balanced the challenge of private ownership with public access for several generations. Indeed, they may be part of a broader answer about how do we revive some of our smaller town centres. If our high streets are to be revived, if they are to become places that people want to come together in, and to compete with online retailing, is it not their fragmented ownership and management which is holding them back from responding to the modern era? So, what does it mean for a space to be public? And how do we square private ownership and public access in either new settlements or indeed in some of the major urban renewal schemes that are coming forward at the moment? Now, my last challenge is how do we better empower people to create lasting communities? I spoke earlier about the ideas behind localism, the idea of devolving power from the centre to both local people and to those who are accountable to them. But what else could be done? Let me suggest three sub-areas, as it were. Let's take planning, for example. Now, there was a hesitant start, if the truth be told, but there are now 1,000 active groups engaged in neighbourhood planning. 75 plans completed for consultation, and I'm told there are a couple of hundred in the pipeline to come through. What more needs to be done, or what needs to be changed to the way that works in order to better empower people? And here, I suspect we need to think beyond simply devising the plan and completing it, and there you are, in saying to people, yes, you'll be part of devising the plan, but you can also be part of seeing how it evolves and how it changes. Secondly, can we use tools like community land trusts better so we can provide more homes for local people? They've originated, as most of us are aware, in rural areas, but they're now starting to come into the cities. I think there's one underway in Mile End. But their adoption has been, let's be perfectly honest here, piecemeal at best. How could we help them house thousands more homes? Is it that the public sector needs to be more sophisticated and intelligent about how we release surplus public sector land? That may well be people's thoughts. But are there other barriers that we need to be thinking about? And third, I think we need to think beyond bricks and mortar. When, as a housing minister, I helped to unlock the new settlement at Cranbrook, just outside of Exeter, much of the focus was inevitably on the provision of the community buildings, the workplaces, the railway station, the hardware, if you like. But for me, just as important was the commitment locally for a minister for Cranbrook from the East Devon Churches Together. The Reverend Mark Gilbertson was in place as the first families moved in, and what it meant, therefore, there weren't just community buildings, there were people ready to build the community. It's that social, less tangible certainly, but just as important side that I think acts as the glue that binds the community together. And to be honest with you, it is the exception in most of these cases, not the rule. The question is, how do we in politics, how do the community leaders, how do developers actually make this something that is a natural part? And I'm talking here both in the broader sense of community work. It doesn't have to be someone of religious denomination. It is having that ability, that community work are there and seen as important as the community whole. So, Chairman, our growing population does mean that we are going to have to rethink how we accommodate more people on what is, after all, a small island. And it won't be easy, either for government or councils, especially where people fear that overdevelopment is being imposed against their wishes. And the property world is also going to face, I think, increased problems as protest groups become more sophisticated in stymieing developments, and often at great cost. So there is a strong argument for rethinking on all sides how we do this, for recognizing that decisions when you involve local people are more accountable, that centrally determined solutions rarely work on the ground, and that where people are part of the decision-making process, they will tend to then work to make that process succeed. Ladies and gentlemen, we face a series of long-term challenges as we seek to build and to renew both our homes and our cities. A larger population, greater longevity, and of course, town centres in need of reinvention. But I think if we start from the premise that each of us, policymakers, developers, and community workers, can learn from the other, then I think we can create the kinds of places where people choose to make their home. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. I'm sure you'll all agree that was a fascinating speech. I'm going to ask Mark one question and Chris one question before I open it up, and we'll take a round of questions from the floor before I send you off to your thematic groups. Mark, can I start with you and where you ended up with your speech on kind of empowering people? I suspect I'm not alone, having had a brief career as a failed politician, in feeling an ambivalence about localism, which is it's a great idea in theory, but it's often a pretty crap idea in practice. And what I mean by that is that if localism is badly done, if the forms of engagement lead people to be defensive, if self-appointed community leaders with an axe to grind hijack a cause, if those who seek to engage the community do it in a self-serving rather than a genuinely open-minded and inquiring way, it can all go very badly wrong. And when it does, people use the rallying cry of localism to justify all kinds of not terribly helpful approaches. What's the right balance? Because localism contains in it this notion of ad hocery, that it must bottom up, whatever emerges, whatever happens. Well, on the other hand, there's demonstrably good ways of doing it and bad ways of doing it.
Oh, I think most politicians would love to be able to feel that they've got levers they can just pull in the centre and everything works neatly, but most of my lifetime we've had centralism, if you like, turning it around the other way, and we can all point to true horrors that have been developed over the years, which sink estates, legions, which were all centrally determined and never worked. I think the answer is not only seeking to empower people, but also to make sure that there's a missing skill set here. You're quite right. Some protest groups can grab a situation and drag it away. But actually, I think one of the weak areas is the lack of engagement in this. To be fair, how long have we had this? 3 or 4 years? In truth, we spent 18 months getting it through Parliament, so that's not actually out in the real world. It's after that it starts the process. I think it's early days. I think we've got local planning departments that, frankly, that don't have the skills to deal with many of these very complex processes. And I think what we need to do is to have the courage to build that up with the civic trusts and the civic societies was something that were very strong before the Second World War. The change in planning, the belief that Whitehall can drive these things forward, the natural desire of politicians in Whitehall to want to be seen to be building things quickly and instantly, meant that centralism was the way to do it. We don't want to wait for that. So I think we need to engage earlier. I think we need training and support. We need a stronger skill set on the ground and a little bit more patience, I think, even though it does make politicians' lives, frankly, much more awkward.
But in a sense, you'd accept the idea of, for want of a better phrase, kind of expert localism, in the sense that you have an approach to localism that is based on expertise in how to best engage people, how best to understand communities, how best to bring... There is technique that is transferable from place to place. It's not simply, we'll engage in whatever way works locally.
No, absolutely. I think this is where we tend to sort of muddle the idea that somehow the moment you've got localism, then the centre stops doing anything. What it means is shifting the balance so that the centre, whether it's a Whitehall department or indeed a major developer, a national developer, is a partner in that process, but is not the dominant, overwhelming force. It is a part of that process. And I think that is a shift of mindset. Essentially, it's turning the telescope around from the other end. At the moment, we tend to look at it from one end of the telescope, and it's very easy to be able to try to say, well, this is the solution they need here, let's pull the lever. Having worked in Whitehall, I've realised that sometimes there's no string underneath the table when you pull the lever.
I think it's also important to remember that for many local communities, the centre is actually the town hall.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, that's a very good point.
Chris, can I just... I was incredibly impressed by the Regent's Place case study. It's not just because you paid for lunch.
Whatever works.
It seems to me that you're really committed to this in British Land. It's kind of got to that point where it's not just kind of a good stuff that you add on. It's just the way that you work. Now you're a big organisation, powerful organisation. You can invest in this kind of stuff. You can see an investment pay off over 30 years, as you say. What do you think is the kind of thought leadership role that you've got in relation to the development sector as a whole, particularly possibly at times of we may be entering a new boom, where it's quite easy, as it were, for people to put schemes together and make money. What role do you see for British Land in trying to encourage good practice across your sector as a whole? Maybe it's not your business. But.
Well, look, I think for me, the starting place for us is do we believe that we have we've developed, pardon the pun, a set of skills which for us can be applied elsewhere? And my conclusion to that is yes. And so what you have seen us do over the last few years is to spend more of our time and effort looking to invest in places where we think this improvement of creation of place, mixed development is a bigger part of our business and where we're actually putting our money. So if you look at what we've done in Paddington, if you look at some land we've assembled down in East London, if you look at what we're looking to do just east of the City of London, these are all examples of where these sort of skills can be applied. And I think it's much better for a commercial organisation to start from a position of we have some skills, we're going to use them in endeavour to drive a return for our shareholders, than kind of standing up and saying, hey, we understand this thing, everybody should follow us. But I also think, and I absolutely agree with you, there are things to learn, there are ways of doing things which are clearly better than other ways. And so I think if you can help to create a body of expertise, a body of knowledge, a belief in certain processes, certain ways of doing things, and that can range from how we engage with communities right through to how we build. I was very interested in Mark's comments, for example, about single usage and that form of planning. I think you're bang on, because I think it is scary for us that we're actually pulling down buildings that are only 20 years old because they're obsolete, and that's just technically obsolete, never mind what the planners have forced on us. So that's the spooky part of what happens these days in this business. But back to it, if we can help to create that, then I think there are a lot of other people who are genuinely interested in contributing to and building on that knowledge. I think your point about the great landed estates, that's a fantastic example of where they've actually been able to combine that long-term view, but also with look at Marylebone High Street. The reason Howard de Walden did what they did to the High Street was they were very confident if they created that greater sense of place, then the values of their own residential would improve, and G did that work well. So, but it's that combination of working together with people, having conversations in bars, or have you tried this? But at its heart, I absolutely believe it has to come back to what we do, and if that drives good economic value, then that will help. Rather than setting ourselves up as some thought leader, I worry about that if we take ourselves too seriously.
Okay, let's take two or three, just two or 3 points at this stage. 1, 2, 3. Wait, sorry, there's someone behind you, and the mic will come to you next.
Thanks very much. Chris Brown from Igloo Regeneration, and just congratulations to Chris and Adrian and Matthew for putting this on, because it's brilliant. And also congratulations to Mark. That was the best political speech I've heard in this area ever.
It's because he's not a minister anymore, isn't it?
Yeah.
He was very boring when he was a minister.
Yeah, I spotted that as well. The question is one for Mark, and it's about levers of government, and it's particularly using the example of community-led development, and you talked about East London Community Land Trust. And I guess where they're trying to grapple with the system on behalf of these community organisations who want housing, they want new housing, they want to do development, they want to lead it, they want it to be good quality. And the entire system stops them at every turn. And I just wonder, you were there for a far too short a time. If you were there again, what would you do to pull the right lever?
Just hold on to that for a second, Mark, and we'll take the other two.
Thank you. John Palmerton from Peter Brett. I do think it's a great debate. Question for Chris, really picking up Mark's fourth challenge, which is really about I'll remind you, long-term investment in town centres, town and city centres. And you mentioned what Howard and Walden did at Marylebone High Street, although they had to actually buy some more in order to get the critical mass to do it, but yeah. My question, I suppose, and this is slightly direct, but it's why is it so difficult for large investors, institutional investors, major development companies like British Land to make long-term investment in the high street?
Okay, and then there was a third point there.
Hi, it's Graham Randalls from NEF Consulting. I'd like to thank the panel for a great presentation. I particularly like Mark's 5 challenges, but I'd like to add a 6th one. I know this event is called Socially Productive Places, but I don't think we can have socially productive places and divorce that from environmentally sustainable places. We've just had another IPCC report with dire warnings about climate change again. Most big developments, if we take the Regent's Place example, have got a 30-year time horizon or longer. How do we make sure that the socially productive places are really, truly environmentally sustainable in the long term?
Well, that's very neat. There's one for you, Mark. There's one for you, Chris, and there's one for both of you. So, Chris, why don't you start off with a response on the long-term town centre point and also the environmental one?
Sure. Look, I think first of all, we're in the business of making large investments. It goes with the territory. And so there's no fear on our part in making big investments, quite big investments. The biggest single impediment in most town centres is achieving scale, because generally speaking, ownership today is so splintered that it's almost impossible to contemplate how you can get size and scale. Now, I would say in passing that when you add to that the time, some of the stuff that Mark talked about in terms of, you're faced with a planning system that probably isn't relevant to what that town centre could be made into today, and you sort of think, how am I going to do this and how am I going to do it? So where we end up being driven to, and it works well for us, and we just invested £500 million in Paddington Central. Why is that? Because we can buy it in one go. There's a lot of work we can be done. We're working with the planning authorities, actually quite sympathetic to all the things that need to be done, and we're kind of up and running within a time frame where we can look our investors in the eye and go, hey, we can make a return for you. So it's really that. I think the environmentally, the piece is challenging, and we spent a lot of time thinking about it. I would just pick on one part of what Mark said, which I think is really quite interesting. It was all interesting, obviously, but this point around, if you can, for example, put older people closer to the centre of towns and cities, and if you can crowd around them the facilities that they would need. So take one simple example, as you know, as people get older, they're less good at regulating their own temperature. They need to be kept warmer. In good old England, that's no mean feat. If you spread them out a long way, that costs you a lot more energy than if you can crowd them around. And by the way, they don't have to drive, and so on and so forth. So I think just if we put that single piece into this pie, it can work quite well. But on the ground, some of the actual issues, long-term trade-offs against short-term, how you use steel, all those things, all of that, and we spend a lot of time on this, but it's complicated.
Chris, thank you very much for that opening commendation. I'll send the cheque through later on. There is a truth, actually. I think once you're in government, you feel you're always speaking for collectively, and when you're no longer in government, you do feel a little freer to just speak a little more coherently.
Very diplomatically put.
Yeah, I think I've just got away with that one. Okay, we'll move on swiftly.
Feel free to tweet that.
I think the answer to your question... Yes, there was once a former career, is now an ex, probably. Leeds is a very good example where what they've done is they've actually come together with a really good community build project. And where I think we made the mistake, we have community land trusts, which are about the land, self-evidently, and we've had custom build policies, which were really about individuals. And to be fair, Chris Hopkins, my successor, and Eric have now shifted the rules so that the two come together and there's a pot of money so that community groups can now apply to custom build a number of properties on community land trusts. So you've got the two bits that you need together to do that. And I think that's potentially the thing that could really move this forward. The third bit we need to do is to find a way to flush out land and buildings that government at all levels, frankly, is failing to use well. Local health trusts are big parties in this one, I have to say. It's a tricky one because you end up with a bureaucracy, but I think that's combination of the two is there. And then on, Graham, on the environmental side, I think the problem is that government, and let's be honest, a lot of private owners don't either, don't look at the whole life cycle costing of buildings. A lot of it, and Treasury rules are at the heart of this, are constantly looking, value for money is actually determined principally in terms of cash. Let's be perfectly honest about that. How much money can I get today? If we could change that thinking, and this is one of the things I want to sort of lobby about, having seen it in practice, so that actually when we think about value, certainly as a taxpayer, I would like to think that if the state owns a whole series of assets, that we're thinking about the whole life cycle and being more of a partner and not the usual Treasury problem of wanting to be completely divorced from risk. So I think that whole life cycle costing is a critical shift.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so let me tell you how the next hour and a half, couple of hours are going to work. Slightly complex, so you have to listen carefully. There are 3 breakout sessions that we're about to have. Strand A is on personal financial well-being, and it'll be in the Tavern room. Strand B is on social return on community investment. It'll be the Benjamin Franklin room, which is immediately underneath this room. And third is economic growth across city regions, which will be in the Prince Philip room, which is on the first floor on kind of that end of the building. There'll be 2 sessions of these strands, so you can go out to 2 out of 3. One starts kind of now, and the second starts at 2:40. Those sessions will end at 3:40. There'll be a tea and coffee break, and then we'll reconvene for a plenary session with some really good speakers in our closing session. So I hope you will go to those afternoon sessions and get a lot out of them. We'll feed them back into that final session. This has been a really great way to set the scene. So can I just ask you to join me in thanking Chris Grigg and Mark Prisk.